President Biden at the White House signing an executive order outlining new electric vehicle goals here in America. The president signing that executive order calling for electric vehicles to make up between 40 and 50% of all new U.S. auto sales by 2030. Does include purchasing incentives. We'll talk about those in a minute, but of course there you see the president with some of his colleagues in Congress, as well as the CEO of GM on the left-hand side there, Mary Barra, and we did have the representative from Michigan, of course, where GM is based and where Ford is based as well. And that's Representative Debbie Dingell on the right-hand side. Pete Buttigieg just behind Mary Barra there as well to celebrate this executive order, all in the vein of keeping America competitive on the global stage and to combat the climate crisis. Back to these purchasing incentives quickly, just for our viewers to know how this affects you as a consumer. If you're buying an EV for the first time, you're going to get a $7,500 tax credit. The president outlining an additional $2,500 credit for a USA-made electric vehicle. And then on top of that, another $2,500 tax credit for union-made electric vehicles. That's going to save you a lot of money, more than $10,000 if you're buying an electric vehicle for the first time. But notably not in attendance, of course, is Tesla CEO Elon Musk. The president taking time today there at the White House to speak to the efforts of unions and how important unions are in the auto space in America. Of course, Tesla does not have its hands in the union business. There's no union representing its own workers. And Tesla notably not in attendance as President Biden celebrates there with the leaders of other automakers based here in the U.S. I know Alicia is joining me. We've got a guest to bring in as well. Yeah. Alicia, what's your take?
A lot to discuss here, right? I thought it was interesting to note the president's kind of tone. He essentially said that the EV revolution is coming. It's happening. There's no stopping it. It's just a matter of, in his words, whether we're going to lead or fall behind on that front. And then he noted, obviously, that China's ahead of us in this space, especially when it comes to the battery component of electric vehicles. And that was a really big focus for him, that we need to kind of pick up battery manufacturing. Talking about that at one point, saying that we need obviously 500,000 charging stations at least there, boosting manufacturing capacity with grants and loans, and then what you mentioned there on the consumer side of things, increasing tax benefits to incentivize consumers to go ahead and buy these vehicles and make the actual conversion 50%, 40 to 50% by 2030. But we know manufacturers like Ford and GM really want to go all electric by 2035. So much to talk about here. Let's bring in Dan Ives, Managing Director of Equity Research at Wedbush Securities. Because Dan, we know that you have been really bullish on the EV space for some time now. Let's get your thoughts on how much of a game changer is Biden's executive order for the auto industry.
Look, I think it's a major first step. I mean, as part of this green tidal wave that we expect to see in the U.S. Take a step back, 2% of automotive is EV in the U.S. In China, it's about 5%. So clearly, we've lagged, but ultimately, it's a carrot and the stick. You got to lay out the incentives. Tax incentives are key. Lift the ceiling for GM and Tesla. That's also important in terms of the 200,000 ceiling. And we believe this is part of a $5 trillion green tidal wave we expect over the next decade.
Dan, it's Kristen here. Look, I know you cover the space closely. I know you cover the companies closely. I am curious with these 3 different incentives now that the president is laying out for consumers, how does that change the game? How does that change potential demand from U.S. consumers for these vehicles?
I think it increases demand anywhere from 12 to 15% off the bat. Now, it's important because when we talk about price parity and everything going on with EVs, there needs to be the incentives. I mean, most consumers are kind of fence-sitting. They'll go traditional gasoline or EV. A lot of it comes down to price. I think this is the first step. When you talk about some of the ambitious goals laid out there, I think it's just what we're starting to see. It's not just Tesla. Look at GM. They're going fully EV by 2035, everything Mary and team are doing. But it starts with tax incentives. And ultimately, we think the next thing that's important is the charging stations. Today, 100,000 charging stations. You need 500,000 by the end of the decade to support these goals.
You know, kind of in that same vein, we got a picture up of Biden driving one of these electric vehicles right now on the front lawn of the White House. We, of course, noted that he had some really excitement around the first electric Corvette, citing that Mary Barra promised him that he'll get to drive that when that first one is made. You know, I want to talk about prices, you know, talking about these tax incentives. Do these kind of tax incentives, anywhere from $7,500, you know, Christian mentioned one for $2,500 there, do they offset these manufacturers having to deal with the pressure on pricing on the consumer end? Do we end up seeing higher priced vehicles because they're offset by these tax incentives?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the one thing you got to remember, which is very important, is that battery technology prices are going to go down probably between 30 to 50% the next 3 to 5 years. So that's the single most expensive component in EVs. That really is enabling price to really come down. I mean, I think on average, we're going to start to see 30, 35K type of EV cars. That's important to get to the masses. I mean, we think we'll have 10% EV penetration in the US by 2025. Now, there is a margin hit. I mean, clearly we'll see it with GM as well, but it goes back to like, if you look where this is all heading, we view it as the biggest transformation to the auto industry since the 1950s. That's why GM's going fully EV, Ford, VW, and others.
You know, Dan, my big question is, we've all seen how this pandemic has changed our lives. For anyone wanting a vehicle, they probably had to wait months to get it. We know people have been furloughed at times because there just are not the semiconductors to produce these cars that need those semiconductors in their consoles. And of course, President Biden saying over and over again when pitching his infrastructure bill that he wants to make sure the U.S. does not rely on other countries, namely those in Asia, for semiconductors to get the job done. These commitments, more than $6 billion in grants for battery production, development, and recycling as part of this $1 trillion infrastructure investment. Is that enough? Does that get the job done to protect the U.S. consumer and U.S. companies?
Look, it's a quagmire because the reality is that the supply chain's built in Asia. And that's something I don't really see massively changing over the coming years. I think what's important, you start to see more manufacturing in the U.S. You start to see more innovation, especially when it comes to EVs. But no doubt in this U.S.-China cold tech war, which is obviously continuing to really step up, this decoupling is becoming an issue. And the only thing that we have in terms of at our arsenal is to further expand manufacturing in the supply chain in the U.S. And I think that's really what you're seeing today. This is the first step, especially in this EV arms race that we're seeing take place.
You know, you noted earlier 12 to 15% potential increase in demand, obviously coming with this news of these tax incentives. I wonder, you know, looking beyond just, you know, a year or so from now, but, you know, years to come, what is the potential growth rate that we're going to be seeing from the electric vehicle space, just given what we know right now from the infrastructure plan, now, of course, to the president's latest executive order?
Yeah, I mean, just to put some numbers around it, we think it's about 5x growth between now and 2026. So EVs, and obviously for anyone that drives around, not just in California, you start seeing more and more EVs across the board. And I think you're starting to get the price parity, more and more consumers focused on it. Charging stations need to ultimately get built out, but it goes back to, it's a green tidal wave that is really upon us. We've seen it globally take place in China, but I think in the U.S. now, you're really starting to see that yellow brick road built out from an infrastructure perspective, charging stations, from the supply chain. That's really now laying out something that we're going to finally see this massive shift toward EVs over the coming years in the U.S.
Dan, that was going to be my question. I mean, quite simply, is this a goal that the U.S. can reach, knowing that we've got COVID concerns lingering, a semiconductor shortage that isn't going away? Can we reach 50% by 2030?
I think it's ambitious goals. You have to also remember there's a lot of potential jobs. We'll call it a Rubik's Cube, right? In terms of states that rely more and more on automotive, traditional diesel supply chain. What happens to those jobs? So it's important that this is a very complex topic that needs to be ultimately navigated to make sure more jobs net come rather than are lost as part of this kind of transition. But I do believe directionally, I think it's accurate. I think by the end of the decade, we're looking on the low end anywhere from 40% to maybe on the high end 50% of automotive being EVs domestically.
Dan, my next question is a bit tangential to this kind of story, in a sense that what happens with all of these traditional vehicles? Have we ever had this time in history where we're going to be seeing this massive conversion from traditional vehicles to electric vehicles? Is there another market, another industry that builds up out of this?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to go back. This is the biggest transformation to the auto industry since 1950s. And part of why I view it as almost a fourth industrial revolution. It's really new ground in terms of the transformation that we're seeing. The only thing I can compare it to is really, as we saw, in terms of late 90s, in terms of the technology industry, go through the internet, e-commerce, enterprise bubble, that ultimately, despite sort of the bubble bursting, is really where we are today because of that digital transformation. So I think this is going to change the industry. There's going to be winners and losers, but I think what's important is it's not just Tesla that wins. You're going to have supply chain players across the board, traditional players, VW, GM, Ford, and I think this is really going to be a renaissance of growth for some of these companies like a GM that struggled, more than we've seen over the last decade.
Dan, let me ask you this. We don't have a ton of time left, but I know already there are 110,000 public electric vehicle charging stations here in the U.S. $7.5 billion as part of this infrastructure plan committed to building out new public charging stations. Where are those charging stations needed? How many are needed to make this goal feasible?
You need at least 400,000 by the end of the decade, and that's a bare minimum. 500,000 would sort of be best case. It's the carrot and the stick, because you need ultimately the charging stations for EVs to work. If you went on a trip and all of a sudden there was one charging station, you waited 4 hours to charge, would that work? No. So that's why federal funding is key. And you look at what we've seen in Europe, China, other parts of Asia. It's important that this is laid out, because then otherwise they become ambitious goals that don't have the foundation.
Yeah, this is a story, obviously, that we can continue talking about just in terms of the runway for growth, the opportunities in this space. It's a story we're going to continue to revisit as things continue to grow. Momentum continues to take up for the EV space. Thank you so much, Dan Ives, Managing Director of Equity Research at Wedbush Securities.